My name is Laura, 33 years old, and yesterday, I walked away from the $3 million mansion that I bought with my own money. My husband, David, waved legal papers in my face, his eyes cold as winter. I never thought the man who vowed to cherish me would try to steal everything I worked for. But as I signed those documents and placed the keys on the marble table, I knew something he did not. If you have ever had to stand up for what is rightfully yours, let me know where you are watching from and hit subscribe to follow my journey to reclaiming what was mine. I grew up in a small town in Ohio where hard work was not just valued but expected. My father, John, was a mechanic who worked 60-hour weeks at the local garage, his hands permanently stained with motor oil, no matter how much he scrubbed them clean each night. My mother, Susan, was a nurse at the community hospital, often working double shifts to help make ends meet. They were honest, hard-working people who taught me the value of independence and determination. From a young age, I dreamed of financial freedom. I watched my parents struggle to pay bills despite their relentless work ethic, and I promised myself that my future would be different. I buried myself in books, studying late into the night while my high school friends were out having fun. The effort paid off when I received a full scholarship to an Ivy League university, becoming the first person in my family to attend college. College was both terrifying and exhilarating. I felt out of place among classmates who came from wealth and privilege, but I refused to be intimidated. I doubled down on my studies, majoring in business and finance, and graduated summa cum laude. My parents sat in the audience at graduation, tears streaming down their faces. That moment remains one of my proudest achievements. After graduation, I landed a job at a small tech startup in Seattle. The salary was modest, but I saw potential for growth. I worked tirelessly, arriving before anyone else and leaving long after dark. My first apartment was a tiny studio with barely enough room for a bed and desk, but it was mine, paid for with my own money, and that meant everything to me. My breakthrough came 2 years into the job when I developed a marketing strategy that transformed our company from an unknown entity into an industry leader. The campaign focused on real people using our products to solve everyday problems, connecting with consumers in a way that our competitors had failed to do. The company's revenue tripled within 6 months, and suddenly everyone wanted to know the mind behind the strategy. My rise through the ranks was swift after that. I was promoted to marketing director, then chief marketing officer by the time I turned 28. The financial rewards followed, and I began to build the wealth I had always dreamed of. I was careful with my money, investing wisely and living below my means despite my growing income. I watched my bank account grow, from thousands to hundreds of thousands, and eventually to millions. It was at a high-profile charity gala that I first met David. I had donated $50,000 to a children's hospital fundraiser, and as a major donor, I was seated at the main table. David was there, representing his law firm, which was also a sponsor of the event. He was strikingly handsome in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, with dark hair, intense blue eyes, and a confidence that commanded attention. During dinner, he asked thoughtful questions about my career and seemed genuinely impressed by my achievements. Unlike many men I had dated who were intimidated by my success, David appeared to admire it. He listened intently as I talked about my work, asking insightful questions that showed he was truly engaged. When he asked for my number at the end of the evening, I felt that flutter of excitement that had been absent from my dating life for years. Our first date was at an exclusive restaurant overlooking Puget Sound. The conversation flowed effortlessly as we shared stories about our childhoods, our career ambitions, and our views on life. David talked about his work as a corporate attorney and his dream of starting his own firm someday. He spoke with such passion that I couldn't help but be drawn to him. What followed was a whirlwind romance straight out of a fairy tale. David took me to the finest restaurants, surprised me with weekend getaways to quaint bed and breakfasts in Maine, and once even arranged a private viewing of a new exhibition at the Seattle Art Museum. He was thoughtful, romantic, and seemingly supportive of my career and independence. The night he proposed, 6 months after we met, he took me back to the charity gala where we had first met, which was being held again. This time, when the donation acknowledgments were being read, the host announced a special gift in my name. David had donated $100,000 to the Children's Hospital in my honor. As I sat there, stunned, he got down on one knee and presented a stunning diamond ring. I said yes without hesitation, believing I had found a partner who truly valued me for who I was. David continuously praised my business acumen, my independence, and my drive. He would tell me how refreshing it was to be with a woman who had her own goals and achievements. I believed every word, never imagining that the very traits he claimed to admire would later become the source of his resentment. In those early days, we would stay up late into the night discussing our future together. David talked about us as equal partners in life who would support each other's dreams. He even suggested that someday we might start a business together, combining my marketing expertise with his legal knowledge. Everything he said and did reinforced my belief that I had found someone who would never ask me to diminish myself for his ego. How could I have known then that the man who held my hands and promised to cherish my strength would later try to break it? That the same lips that praised my independence would sneer at me to sign away everything I had built? But I'm getting ahead of myself. Back then, all I saw was the beginning of what I thought would be my happily ever after. Our wedding day arrived exactly 1 year after our first meeting. It was everything I had ever dreamed of, an elegant affair at a historic estate outside Seattle. 200 guests witnessed our union, including my proud parents and David's extensive network of colleagues and friends from the legal community. My father, usually a man of few words, gave a heartfelt speech about how David was the son he never had, and how grateful he was to see me with someone who appreciated my strength and determination. In the months leading up to the wedding, I had made a significant decision. With my investments performing exceptionally well and a substantial bonus from work, I decided to purchase our dream home. The property was a stunning colonial mansion in one of Seattle's most prestigious neighborhoods, with 6 bedrooms, 7 bathrooms, a swimming pool, and meticulously landscaped gardens. The price tag was $3 million, a sum that would have seemed impossible to the young girl from Ohio, but one I could now afford. The mansion featured soaring ceilings with hand-carved crown molding, original hardwood floors that gleamed in the sunlight, and floor-to-ceiling windows that filled every room with natural light. The master suite occupied an entire wing of the second floor, with a sitting area, a fireplace, and a bathroom that rivaled those in luxury hotels. The kitchen was a chef's dream, with top-of-the-line appliances, custom cabinetry, and marble countertops. There was even a wine cellar in the basement that could hold over 1,000 bottles. When I showed David the house, his eyes widened in appreciation. He walked through each room, admiring the craftsmanship and architectural details. When I told him I was considering buying it, he embraced me and said, "This is perfect for us, darling. You have such an eye for value. This property will only appreciate over time. Your business sense never ceases to amaze me." I purchased the house in my name, as we had not yet married, and because I was paying for it entirely from my own funds. David never objected to this arrangement. In fact, he praised my financial acumen, saying it made perfect sense for tax purposes. I remember feeling a warm glow of appreciation for his support of my independence. The first year of our marriage was blissful. We traveled extensively, visiting Paris, Rome, and Tokyo. We hosted lavish dinner parties where David would proudly introduce me to his colleagues and friends, boasting about my career achievements and business insights. We seemed to be the perfect power couple, each successful in our own right, but stronger together. The first hint of trouble came so subtly that I nearly missed it. We were discussing renovations to the garden when I mentioned wanting to install a Japanese-inspired meditation area. David frowned slightly and said, "Are you sure that's a good investment? It seems like an unnecessary expense." I was taken aback. The cost was minimal compared to our resources, and he had never questioned my spending before. I brushed it off as a momentary concern, but similar comments began to appear more frequently. When I purchased a new car, David asked if I had consulted with him first. When I donated to my alma mater, he questioned whether we should be more conservative with our charitable giving. Each comment was delivered with a smile or a casual tone that made it difficult to object without seeming overly sensitive. Then came the suggestion that began to shift our dynamic more dramatically. Over dinner one evening, David mentioned that his law practice was expanding and that he was taking on more high-profile clients. "You know, Laura," he said, taking a sip of wine, "it might be time for you to consider stepping back from your career. We're financially secure now, and it would be the perfect time to start thinking about building a family." I nearly choked on my food. We had discussed children, of course, but always in the context of balancing family with both our careers. David had previously expressed admiration for female executives who successfully managed motherhood and professional life. His sudden change in perspective caught me completely off guard. When I reminded him of our earlier conversations about both maintaining our careers, he looked almost confused. "Did I say that? I suppose I hadn't fully considered how demanding it would be on you to juggle both. I just want what's best for our future family. You wouldn't want our children raised by nannies, would you?" The conversation left me uneasy, but I tried to rationalize his concerns as coming from a place of care. Still, I noticed that David began to make more comments about female colleagues who had left the workforce after having children, always framing their decisions as wise and admirable. David's behavior toward my finances continued to shift as well. He began asking to review our accounts together, suggesting that as a married couple, we should be fully transparent. While this seemed reasonable on the surface, his scrutiny of my personal spending became increasingly invasive. He questioned purchases I made, investments I was considering, and even small expenses like a lunch with colleagues. One evening, I came home late from work to find David in my home office, my laptop open in front of him. When I asked what he was doing, he smiled casually and said, "Just looking over some of our investments. I noticed you moved some funds around last week." The fact that he had accessed my computer without permission sent a chill through me. When I pointed this out, his expression darkened momentarily before he recovered with a laugh. "Laura, you make it sound like I was spying on you. We're married. There should be no secrets between us. I was just taking an interest in our financial health. Our, not yours." The subtle shift in language did not escape me. Neither did the fact that David had never referred to his own finances as ours or invited me to review his accounts. I began to feel a growing knot of anxiety in my stomach, but pushed it aside. This was David, the man who had swept me off my feet, who had seemed so proud of my independence. Yet the comments continued to accumulate. "You're too independent for your own good sometimes," he would say with a laugh, after I made a decision without consulting him. "Sometimes I wonder if you even need me," with an expression that was meant to be joking, but held an edge of resentment. The David who had once praised my strength now seemed threatened by it. The man who had admired my business success now questioned my every financial move. I found myself increasingly confused, wondering if I was overreacting or if the supportive partner I thought I had married was slowly revealing a different side altogether. As our second year of marriage progressed, the subtle changes in David became more pronounced. The warm, supportive man I had fallen in love with was increasingly distant and cold. Our dinner conversations, once filled with lively discussions and shared laughter, turned into silent affairs or critical monologues from David about my shortcomings. Nothing I did seemed to please him anymore. If I wore a dress I loved to a work function, he would comment that it was too revealing or inappropriate. "That dress makes you look like you're trying too hard, Laura. A woman of your position should dress with more restraint." The same dress he had previously complimented now became a target for his criticism. My circle of friends, which David had initially embraced, gradually became another point of contention. He would make dismissive remarks about my college friend Rachel, calling her immature and a bad influence because of her recent divorce. My work colleague Mark was deemed inappropriate because David claimed he clearly had romantic intentions, despite Mark being happily married with 3 children. Even my management style at work became subject to David's constant critique. He would question my decisions to promote certain team members or my approach to client relationships. "Perhaps you should be firmer with your team," he would suggest. "They seem to take advantage of your kindness." Or, "That client is clearly using you. You need to be more assertive." One afternoon, I came home early from work with a migraine and decided to check my email before lying down. When I opened my laptop, I discovered that my email was already open, with several messages marked as read that I had not viewed. A quick check of my browser history showed that someone had also been looking through my banking portal and investment accounts. My heart raced, as I realized that David must have been systematically monitoring my communications and finances. I felt violated in a way I had never experienced before, as if the private spaces of my life had been invaded without my knowledge or consent. That evening, I confronted David about what I had found. I expected denial, or perhaps even shame, but his response left me speechless. "Yes, I checked your emails and accounts," he admitted without a trace of remorse. "As your husband, I have a right to know what you're doing. I worry about you, Laura. You're so trusting, and there are people who might take advantage of that." When I expressed that his actions felt like a violation of my privacy, his demeanor changed instantly. His eyes narrowed and his voice took on a wounded tone that I was beginning to recognize as manipulative. "I can't believe you would see my concern as a violation," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I do this because I love you so much that the thought of losing you terrifies me. Do you have any idea what it's like to love someone so much that you constantly fear they'll leave you?" His performance was so convincing that for a moment, I found myself apologizing to him, comforting him for the pain caused by my completely reasonable objection to his invasion of my privacy. It was only later, alone in the bathroom where I had gone to collect myself, that I recognized the masterful way he had turned the situation around, making himself the victim when he was clearly the one at fault. After that incident, David became even more overt in his efforts to isolate me from my support network. He would create last-minute work emergencies that forced us to cancel dinner plans with my friends. When my parents planned to visit, he suddenly remembered an important conference we both needed to attend out of state. Each cancellation came with a seemingly reasonable explanation, but the pattern became impossible to ignore. My once vibrant social life dwindled until weeks would pass without me seeing anyone outside of work and David. Even my work relationships began to suffer as David would call me multiple times throughout the day, often with trivial questions or concerns that required my immediate attention. My colleagues noticed the constant interruptions, and I could sense their growing discomfort around me. The isolation made me increasingly dependent on David for emotional connection, which I now realize was exactly his intention. Without the perspective of friends or family, It became easier for him to control the narrative of our relationship and my perception of reality. Then came a discovery that shed new light on David's behavior. While searching for a document in our home office, I found financial statements from David's law firm that he had clearly attempted to hide. The documents revealed that his practice was in serious financial trouble, with mounting debts and declining client revenue. The revelations stunned me. David had always portrayed his firm as thriving and successful. He drove a luxury car, wore designer suits, and never hesitated to pick up the tab at expensive restaurants when dining with colleagues. It appeared that much of this was financed through debt and increasingly desperate financial maneuvers. When I gently approached David about what I had found, offering to help with my own resources and business expertise, his reaction was explosive. "You had no right to look at those documents," he shouted, his face flushed with anger. "This is my business, not yours. Do you think I need my wife to rescue me? What kind of man would that make me? A real man doesn't need his wife to support him financially." His words revealed a toxic pride and deeply traditional views about gender roles that he had carefully concealed during our courtship. The man who had supposedly admired my financial independence now seemed to view it as a threat to his masculinity rather than an asset to our partnership. In the following weeks, David began making more frequent comments about how all of our assets should be managed together, with him as the primary decision-maker. "After all," he would say, "as the man of the house, it's my responsibility to ensure our financial security." Each time he said something like this, I felt a growing sense of alarm. The disconnect between the progressive, supportive partner he had presented himself to be during our courtship and the controlling, traditional husband he was revealing himself to be grew wider by the day. I began to wonder how I had missed these red flags, how I had fallen for someone whose values were so fundamentally opposed to my own. But David had been careful, showing me exactly what I wanted to see until he felt secure enough in the relationship to reveal his true nature. Like a slowly heating pot of water with a frog inside, the changes had happened so gradually that I had not recognized the danger until I was already in too deep. As David's financial troubles worsened, so did his efforts to control our shared resources. It was becoming increasingly clear that he viewed my wealth not as mine, but as a solution to his problems. The question was just how far he was willing to go to get his hands on what I had worked so hard to build. The pivotal moment that finally opened my eyes to the full extent of David's deception came on an ordinary Tuesday evening. I had returned home early from a business dinner that ended sooner than expected and was about to call out to let David know I was home when I heard him speaking in his office. His voice had a conspiratorial tone that made me pause in the hallway. "I need to move quickly on this, Stephen," David was saying, his voice lower than usual but still audible through the partially open door. "She has no idea what's happening. Once these papers are signed, I'll finally have what's rightfully mine." I stood, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. Though he didn't mention my name, I knew instinctively that he was talking about me. Stephen was one of his colleagues at the firm, a man I had met several times at company functions, who had always regarded me with a slightly dismissive attitude. "I think you're taking a risk here," I heard Stephen respond through the speakerphone. "She's not stupid, David. She built that fortune herself." David laughed, a sound so cold and unfamiliar that goosebumps rose on my arms. "She may be clever with marketing campaigns, but she knows nothing about legal matters. She trusts me completely. By the time she realizes what's happened, it'll be too late. The house, the investments, everything will be under my control." I backed away silently, retreating to my car in the garage where I sat, trembling with shock and betrayal. The man I had married, the man I had trusted with my heart and my life, was plotting to steal everything I had worked for. Once the initial shock subsided, I forced myself to think clearly. I needed to understand exactly what David was planning and how far along he was in his scheme. That night, I pretended nothing was wrong, playing the role of the oblivious wife while my mind raced with plans and contingencies. The next morning, I waited until David left for work before beginning my investigation in his home office. I carefully searched through his files, finding drafts of legal documents hidden in a locked drawer that I opened with the spare key he didn't know I had. What I discovered confirmed my worst fears. David had been systematically transferring small amounts from our joint accounts to a separate account in his name only. The transfers were carefully timed and sized to avoid triggering any alerts, a strategy that spoke of deliberate, long-term planning. More alarmingly, I found draft documents for a revised trust that would give David full control over my assets, including the house. The language was full of legal jargon, clearly designed to obscure the true purpose of the document from someone without legal training. Had I signed these papers without careful review, I would have effectively signed away everything I owned. With hands still shaking from the discovery, I called Catherine Miller, a lawyer I had befriended during a business negotiation years ago. Catherine specialized in family law and high-asset divorces, though I had never imagined needing her services for myself. "Laura, you need to be extremely careful," Catherine warned after I explained the situation. "What you're describing sounds like financial abuse, and based on the documents you've found, David appears to be planning something that could potentially leave you with nothing." Financial abuse. The term hit me like a physical blow. I had heard of emotional and physical abuse, but had never considered that the systematic control and manipulation of finances could be a form of abuse as well. Yet, as Catherine explained the patterns and tactics commonly used, I recognized so many of them in David's behavior over the past year. Under Catherine's guidance, I began gathering evidence and taking steps to protect my assets. I made copies of all the documents I had found and stored them in a secure location outside our home. I checked the deed to the house, confirming it was still solely in my name, and contacted my bank to place additional security measures on my personal accounts. "What David doesn't know," Catherine explained, "is that since the house is in your name only and was purchased before your marriage with your separate funds, it would be very difficult for him to claim it as marital property under Washington law. But we need to be vigilant because he clearly has a strategy in mind." That afternoon, I was reviewing the security measures with my bank when David called. I answered with the same cheerful tone I had always used, disguising the storm of emotions raging within me. "I was just checking to see if you'll be home for dinner," he said, his voice casual and friendly, as if he hadn't been plotting to destroy my financial independence just the night before. "Yes, I'll be home around 6, I replied, amazed at how normal my voice sounded. "Great, I'll see you then." "I love you," he added, words that had once filled me with joy now sounding hollow and false. "I love you too," I responded automatically, then hung up and rushed to the bathroom, overcome with nausea at the lie I had just told. Later that day, David returned home earlier than expected, catching me as I was ending a phone call with Catherine. I quickly said goodbye without mentioning any names, but David's expression told me he was suspicious. "Who was that?" he asked, his tone deceptively light, but his eyes sharp and watchful. "Just a colleague with a question about tomorrow's presentation," I lied, hating the person I was becoming in response to his deception, but knowing I needed to protect myself. For a moment, I thought he believed me, but then he spotted Catherine's business card partially visible under some papers on the counter. He snatched it up before I could react, his face darkening as he read her name and title. "Why are you talking to a divorce attorney?" he demanded, his voice rising with each word. His face contorted with rage, a side of him I had glimpsed only in flashes before. The confrontation that followed was the most frightening experience of our marriage. David's carefully maintained facade cracked completely, revealing the calculating, vindictive man beneath. "If you think you can leave me and keep everything for yourself, you're sadly mistaken," he snarled, his handsome features twisted with anger. "I'll take everything, Laura. The house, the cars, half of your company shares. By the time I'm done with you, you'll wish you had never crossed me." His threats confirmed everything I had discovered, but hearing them spoken aloud still sent ice through my veins. This was no longer about saving my marriage. This was about protecting myself from someone who had been planning to harm me financially for months, possibly years. In the days that followed, I tried to buy time by pretending to reconsider, suggesting we seek counseling together. David, perhaps believing he had scared me into submission, agreed readily, once again donning the mask of the reasonable, loving husband when it suited his purposes. Meanwhile, I took steps to safeguard what I could, transferring some funds to accounts David couldn't access. When I attempted to move a larger sum, however, I discovered that David had already restricted my access to several of our joint investment accounts, using his legal connections to place administrative holds that even I, as the primary account holder, couldn't override without his signature. The realization that I was losing control of my own money sent me into a panic unlike anything I had experienced before. For someone who had worked so hard to achieve financial independence, the thought of having it stripped away was more terrifying than any physical threat could have been. Through it all, David watched me with the calculating gaze of a predator tracking wounded prey, seemingly enjoying my growing distress. He began to pressure me to sign a series of documents he claimed were routine updates to our estate planning. Each time, I found excuses to delay, knowing that Catherine needed more time to develop a counter-strategy. One night, David didn't come home at all. My calls went straight to voicemail, and a text sent late in the evening received no response. I spent the night alternating between worry that something had happened to him and fear that this was another manipulation tactic designed to destabilize me emotionally. He returned the next morning with no explanation for his absence, but his demeanor had changed completely. Gone was the threatening, angry man of the previous days, replaced by the charming, attentive husband I had first fallen in love with. He brought flowers, apologized for his recent behavior, and promised things would be different moving forward. "I'm under so much stress with the firm," he explained, his eyes showing a vulnerability that seemed genuine. "I said things I didn't mean, Laura. You know I would never actually hurt you. We're partners, and I value everything you bring to this relationship." His sudden transformation was so convincing that for a brief moment I almost believed him. But I had seen behind the mask now, and no performance, however skillful, could erase what I knew about his true intentions. Still, I played along, pretending to be relieved and grateful for his apology. If David was changing tactics, I needed to understand why. As Catherine had warned me, the most dangerous time in situations like mine was often when the abuser sensed they were losing control and decided to try a different approach. "I just want us to be happy again," I told him, the half-truth easier to sell than a complete lie. The relief in his eyes confirmed my suspicion. He believed he still had me exactly where he wanted me, unaware that beneath my seemingly compliant exterior, I was preparing for the battle ahead. For the next week, David maintained his loving facade so convincingly that I occasionally caught myself wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. He brought me coffee in bed, sent flowers to my office, and even suggested we plan a vacation to the Maldives to reconnect. The contrast between this attentive husband and the threatening man of the previous week was so stark that it felt like living with someone with a split personality. I maintained my own performance, smiling and accepting his gestures of affection while continuing to work with Catherine behind the scenes. We had daily calls when I could safely speak, usually during my lunch breaks at work or when David was at the gym. Catherine was gathering evidence and preparing for various scenarios, including the possibility that I might need to file for divorce and a restraining order if things escalated. If he becomes aware that you're on to him, things could get dangerous quickly, Catherine warned during one of our calls. Financial abusers often escalate to other forms of control when they feel their power slipping away. The precarious peace between David and me lasted exactly 7 days. On the 8th night, I woke around 2 in the morning, aware of David's absence from our bed. This had become somewhat common, as his sleeping patterns had grown erratic, but something prompted me to get up and look for him. I found him in his office, the door slightly ajar, speaking in hushed tones on the phone. I moved closer, careful to stay out of sight. "Christopher, I understand the risks, but I need this done now," David was saying, tension evident in his voice. "She's getting suspicious, and I can't afford to wait any longer." I recognized the name immediately. Christopher Thompson was one of Seattle's most prominent attorneys, known for handling complex financial cases for the city's elite. I had met him once at a charity function and found him intimidating, a man whose razor-sharp intellect was matched only by his reputation for ruthlessness in the courtroom. "I'm telling you, David," Thompson responded, his voice clear through the speakerphone, "what you're proposing walks a very fine line legally. If she contests these transfers or claims duress during the signing, you could be facing serious consequences." David laughed dismissively. "She won't contest anything. She's too in love with me to fight back. All I need is for her to sign the papers transferring the house and primary accounts. Once that's done, we can move forward with the rest of the plan." My blood ran cold at the calculated way he discussed our relationship, as if my love was merely a weakness to be exploited rather than something to be cherished. "Have you considered what this will do to your reputation if this goes public?" Thompson asked. "Even if you succeed legally, the professional and social fallout could be devastating. By the time anyone realizes what's happened, I'll be financially secure enough that reputation won't matter," David replied with chilling confidence. "Besides, who'll believe her? I'll make sure she looks unstable and financially irresponsible. It's my word against hers, and I'm a respected attorney." I backed away silently, my heart pounding so loudly I feared he might hear it. The casual cruelty with which David discussed destroying not only my financial security, but also my reputation left me breathless with shock and fear. Once safely back in the guest bedroom, I texted Catherine despite the late hour. "Need to meet first thing tomorrow. Emergency." She responded immediately. "My office, 7 a.m. I barely slept that night, lying awake and revisiting every moment of my relationship with David, searching for the signs I had missed. Had there been red flags from the beginning? Was our entire relationship built on calculation and deception? The thought that the love I had felt so deeply might have been nothing but an elaborate trap was almost too painful to bear. At 6:30 the next morning, I told David I had an early meeting and left the house before he was fully awake. 30 minutes later, I sat in Catherine's office recounting the conversation I had overheard. "This changes everything," Catherine said grimly after I finished. "Christopher Thompson doesn't get involved unless there are significant assets at stake and a client willing to play hardball. The fact that even he's expressing concerns about David's approach tells me they're planning something particularly aggressive." "What are my options?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Catherine leaned forward, her expression serious but determined. "There's a strategy we could employ, but it's risky. It would involve appearing to give David exactly what he wants, but with a carefully crafted legal trap built into the documentation." She explained the details of the plan, a bold counterattack that would use David's own tactics against him. As I listened, I felt a mix of admiration for Catherine's ingenuity and fear at the high stakes involved. If the plan failed, I could lose everything. If it succeeded, I would be free of David, but would have to rebuild much of my life from the ground up. "Do you think it'll work?" I asked when she finished explaining. Catherine considered for a moment before answering. "David is counting on your ignorance of legal matters and your emotional attachment to him. He doesn't believe you'll fight back effectively. That underestimation gives us an advantage. But, Laura, I need you to be certain this is what you want. Once we put this in motion, there's no going back." I thought about the man I had married, the future I had imagined for us, and the betrayal that had shattered those dreams. I thought about my parents who had worked so hard to give me opportunities and how they had taught me to stand up for myself. I thought about the years of work and sacrifice that had gone into building my career and financial security. "Do it," I said finally. "I'd rather lose everything fighting for what's mine than live another day with someone who sees me as nothing but a resource to be exploited." The plan required meticulous preparation. Catherine and I worked throughout the day, drafting documents, consulting with financial experts, and establishing secure communication channels. By the time I returned home that evening, everything was in place. Now I just needed David to make his move. I didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, David announced that he had drafted some new estate planning documents that required my signature for our future security. He explained with a smile that no longer reached his eyes. "Can I review them first?" I asked, feigning the casual interest of someone who had no suspicions. "Of course, darling," he replied smoothly. "They're quite standard, but feel free to look them over. I'll be in my office when you're ready to sign." The documents were exactly what I had expected based on the conversation I had overheard. Transfer of property deeds, power of attorney forms, and amendments to our financial accounts that would give David complete control. Reading through the pages of legalese, I marveled at the audacity of his plan and the confidence he must have had in my ignorance or trust. After an hour, I brought the papers to his office, having made a show of reading them thoroughly. David watched me with barely concealed anticipation, a predator about to spring his trap, unaware that he was the one being led into a snare. "Everything looks fine," I said, my voice betraying none of the turmoil I felt. "I just have one small suggestion for this section here." I indicated a passage buried deep in the document, a seemingly innocuous clause about property transfer rights. David barely glanced at it, his eagerness to complete the transaction overriding his usual thoroughness. "It's just clarifying language," I explained, "to make sure the transfer process goes smoothly with the bank." David nodded impatiently. Fine. We can add that. It doesn't change anything substantive." If only he knew how wrong he was. The amendment Catherine had crafted would become the linchpin of our counter-strategy, a legal tripwire that David, in his arrogance, was about to trigger himself. As he made the change and printed a new copy of the document, I steeled myself for what was to come. The next few hours would determine the course of my future, and I needed to play my part perfectly. David had underestimated me from the beginning, seeing only what he wanted to see, a successful but legally naive woman who could be manipulated through her emotions. It was time to show him just how wrong he had been. The modified documents lay on the mahogany desk between us, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the room. David slid them toward me with a Mont Blanc pen that I had given him for our first anniversary. The irony was not lost on me. "Just a few signatures, and everything will be taken care of," he said, his voice gentle, but his eyes hard and calculating. "I've marked all the places where you need to sign." I picked up the pen, feeling its weight in my hand. For a brief moment, I thought about all the different paths my life could have taken, all the choices that had led me to this precise moment. I thought about the young girl from Ohio who had dreamed of financial independence, never imagining that her greatest threat would come from the man she had chosen to share her life with. David mistook my hesitation for reluctance. His demeanor shifted instantly, the mask of concerned husband falling away to reveal the cold manipulator beneath. "Sign, Laura," he mocked, waving the papers in front of me. His voice had lost all pretense of affection. "This is my house now." I looked around at the hand-carved moldings I had admired when I first viewed the property, the marble fireplace I had restored, the custom bookshelves I had commissioned from a local artisan. Every inch of this home represented my hard work, my dreams, my success. "Your house?" I questioned quietly. "I paid for this house entirely with my own money before we were even married. The deed is in my name alone." David's smile was ugly, triumphant. "Not for much longer. Once you sign these papers, everything changes." "I've been patient, Laura. More patient than you deserve. Now it's time for you to do as you're told." His words hung in the air between us, the threat unmistakable. In that moment, I saw with perfect clarity the man I had married, not the supportive partner I had believed him to be, but a predator who had targeted me for my assets from the very beginning. With steady hands that surprised even me, I began to sign the documents, one page after another. David watched with barely concealed glee, no doubt already calculating the wealth that would soon be under his control. When I reached the final page, I paused again, meeting his eyes directly for perhaps the first time in weeks. I signed my name with a flourish, then capped the pen and placed it precisely in the center of the document. "Done," I said simply, rising from my chair. The triumph in David's expression was sickening to witness. He gathered the papers possessively, already turning away from me, as if I had ceased to matter now that I had served his purpose. In a gesture that I had planned with Catherine, but which felt surprisingly natural in the moment, I removed my house keys from my purse and placed them on the table with a soft clink. David turned back, confusion briefly crossing his features. "What are you doing?" "Since the house is no longer mine, I shouldn't keep the keys," I replied, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging within me. "I've already packed a bag. I'll be staying elsewhere tonight." Now David looked uncertain for the first time. This was not the reaction he had expected. Not the tears or pleading he had no doubt anticipated, and perhaps even looked forward to witnessing. "Don't be dramatic, Laura," he said, trying to recapture control of the situation. "You don't need to leave. This is just a legal formality for tax purposes." The lie was so blatant, so insulting to my intelligence, that I almost laughed. Instead, I simply picked up my purse and turned toward the door. I felt his hand grasp my arm, spinning me back to face him. His eyes were wide with disbelief, and the first hints of alarm. "Where do you think you're going? This is ridiculous. We need to discuss this like adults." "There's nothing to discuss, David," I replied gently but firmly, removing his hand from my arm. "You wanted the house and the accounts. Now they're yours. I hope they bring you the happiness you seem to think they will." As I walked toward the front door, I heard him following behind me, his confident demeanor crumbling as he realized his carefully laid plan was not unfolding as expected. "Laura, stop this nonsense right now," he demanded, his voice rising. "You can't just walk away." I paused at the door, turning to face him one last time. The man standing before me was a stranger, his handsome features contorted by frustration and the dawning realization that something was not right. "Goodbye, David," I said simply, then walked through the door and closed it behind me. In my car, parked at the end of the driveway, I finally allowed the tears to come. Not tears of defeat or despair, but of release. For months, I had been living with a growing sense of dread, trying to reconcile the loving husband I thought I had with the manipulative stranger he had revealed himself to be. Now, at last, the pretense was over. The path ahead would be difficult, but it would be mine to choose. I drove to the hotel where Catherine had reserved a room for me, checking in under a name David wouldn't think to look for. As I settled into the anonymous comfort of the hotel suite, I sent a brief text to Catherine. "It's done." Her response came immediately. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will be interesting." That night, alone in the unfamiliar room, I slept more soundly than I had in months. Whatever happened next, I had taken back control of my own story. David had underestimated me from the beginning, seeing only what he wanted to see. Tomorrow, he would discover just how costly that mistake had been. The call from Catherine came just after 9 the next morning. I had been awake since dawn, alternating between moments of doubt and surges of empowering clarity. When my phone lit up with her name, I answered immediately. "It's happening exactly as we predicted," she said without preamble, her voice vibrant with controlled excitement. "Christopher Thompson just called David." Apparently, the conversation was quite animated. "Tell me everything," I said, sitting up straighter in the hotel armchair. "Thompson reviewed the documents this morning and discovered our little addition," Catherine explained. "The repurchase option clause that we inserted allows you to buy back the property for 20% of its market value at any time within the next 5 years. David was so eager to get your signature that he never noticed the change, even though he initialed right next to it." I closed my eyes, relief washing over me. The clause had been our biggest gamble. Buried within the dense legal language of the property transfer document, it established my right to repurchase the mansion for a fraction of its value. Since David had been so focused on gaining control of the property, he had missed the trap that would ultimately return it to me. "Thompson is livid," Catherine continued with undisguised satisfaction. "Apparently, his exact words to David were, 'Do you have any idea what you just let her do?'" The image of David's face as he realized his mistake brought me no joy, only a sense of justice. This was not about revenge, but about reclaiming what was rightfully mine. "What happens now?" I asked. "We've already filed the paperwork to exercise your repurchase option," Catherine replied. "Thompson is trying to contest it, of course, but the documentation is ironclad. David not only signed, but initialed the very clause that undoes his entire plan. No judge will rule in his favor, especially once we present evidence of his attempts to manipulate you into signing." We had agreed to meet at Catherine's office at 11 to review next steps. As I dressed in one of the few professional outfits I had thought to pack, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The painful revelation of David's true nature had been devastating, but it had also forced me to reclaim the strength and independence that had defined me before our marriage. Catherine's office was a hive of activity when I arrived. Paralegals moved purposefully between offices, carrying documents and speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Catherine met me in the reception area, her usual professional demeanor brightened by a smile of genuine satisfaction. "David and Thompson are waiting in the conference room," she informed me. "Are you ready for this?" I took a deep breath, smoothed my jacket, and nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." The conference room fell silent as we entered. David sat at the far end of the table, his normally immaculate appearance showing signs of strain. His hair was uncombed, his expensive shirt wrinkled as if he had slept in it. Beside him, Christopher Thompson looked grim, his legendary composure visibly shaken. "Thank you for meeting with us," Catherine began formally, taking her place opposite Thompson. "We believe we can resolve this matter efficiently if everyone is willing to be reasonable." "This is outrageous," David burst out, unable to contain himself. She tricked me into signing those papers. This constitutes fraud. Thompson placed a restraining hand on David's arm, but his own expression was hardly more composed. "Ms. Bennett," he said, addressing Catherine, "your client inserted a clause into a legal document without proper disclosure. No court will uphold such an underhanded tactic." Catherine smiled pleasantly, as if they were discussing nothing more contentious than the weather. "Actually, Mr. Thompson, every change to the document was properly initialed by your client. The clause was neither hidden nor misrepresented. If Mr. Wilson failed to read what he was signing, that hardly constitutes fraud on our part." She opened a folder and slid several documents across the table. "Furthermore, we have substantial evidence that Mr. Wilson has been engaging in a pattern of financial abuse and attempted coercion. These are copies of emails, financial records, and witness statements that we are prepared to submit to the court if necessary." David's face drained of color as he glanced at the documents. I knew what they contained: evidence of his systematic attempts to gain control of my finances, recordings of his threats, testimonies from friends who had witnessed his controlling behavior. The case Catherine had built was devastating. "What do you want?" Thompson asked, his tone clipped but pragmatic. The legendary attorney was cutting his losses, recognizing that the situation had shifted irrevocably in our favor. Catherine outlined our terms. I would exercise my option to repurchase the house. David would relinquish all claims to my personal assets and business interests. In return, we would not pursue legal action for his attempted financial manipulation, allowing him to salvage what remained of his professional reputation. As Catherine spoke, I watched David's face, searching for some sign of the man I had believed I was marrying. There was nothing familiar in his cold eyes or the bitter line of his mouth. Had that man ever existed, or had he been a carefully crafted illusion from the beginning? The negotiations continued for over 2 hours, with Thompson working to salvage what he could for his client, while David alternated between sullen silence and bursts of indignation. By early afternoon, we had reached an agreement that protected my interests while allowing David to walk away without the public humiliation of a court case. As we prepared to leave, David suddenly addressed me directly for the first time since I had entered the room. "You'll regret this, Laura," he said, his voice low and venomous. "I loved you, and this is how you repay me." I looked at him for a long moment, seeing him clearly at last. "No, David, you never loved me," I replied quietly. "You loved what I could give you. There's a difference." His face flushed with anger, but, before he could respond, Thompson intervened, practically dragging him from the room. As the door closed behind them, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, as if I had been carrying a burden so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. The weeks that followed were challenging but liberating. I moved back into my home, which felt different now, both tainted by the painful memories of my marriage and reclaimed as truly mine. I changed the locks, redecorated spaces that held too many reminders of David, and gradually began to rebuild my sense of security. My career, which had suffered during the tumultuous final months of my marriage, became a source of renewed purpose and joy. I threw myself into new projects, my creativity and confidence flowing freely now that I was no longer walking on eggshells at home. Healing from the emotional wounds was slower and more complex. There were nights when I woke in a cold sweat, haunted by the realization of how close I had come to losing everything. There were moments of self-recrimination when I questioned how I could have been so blind to David's true nature. But gradually, with the help of therapy and the support of friends who welcomed me back into their lives, I began to forgive myself for trusting someone who had not deserved that trust. 6 months after the confrontation in Catherine's office, I established the Financial Freedom Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping women recognize and escape financially abusive relationships. The foundation provided education about the warning signs of financial control, legal assistance for those trying to protect their assets, and emergency grants for women who needed immediate financial support to leave dangerous situations. Through this work, I met others who had experienced similar betrayals, women from all walks of life whose stories echoed aspects of my own. In helping them reclaim their independence, I found a deeper purpose for the pain I had endured. What David had intended to break me had instead revealed strengths I had not known I possessed. Looking back now, I can see the warning signs that I missed or chose to ignore. The subtle shift from admiration of my success to resentment of my independence. The gradual isolation from friends and family. The increasing attempts to control and monitor my finances. These were not simply personality flaws or stress responses, but calculated steps in a pattern of abuse that had been disguised as love and concern. The most profound lesson I learned through this experience was not about David or even about financial security, but about trusting myself. The voice of intuition that I had silenced when it tried to warn me of danger is now my most valued guide. I have learned to listen to that voice, to honor my own perceptions, even when others try to convince me they are wrong. True love, I now understand, never asks you to diminish yourself or surrender your autonomy. It does not view your strength as a threat or your success as something to be controlled. Real partnership celebrates independence rather than undermining it, supports growth rather than restricting it. The journey from that terrible day when David demanded I sign away my home to where I stand now has been long and often painful. There were moments when it would have been easier to surrender, to believe that peace was worth any price. I am profoundly grateful that I found the courage to fight instead, not just for my material possessions, but for my right to determine my own future. Sometimes the most powerful act is not holding on, but letting go. When I placed those keys on the table and walked away from my home, I was not surrendering, but making a strategic retreat that ultimately led to victory. Sometimes we must be willing to release what matters to us in the moment in order to reclaim what matters most in the long run. If my story resonates with you, if you have ever had to fight to reclaim what was rightfully yours, I hope it gives you courage. Have you ever had to walk away from something to ultimately win? Share your experience in the comments below. And if this story helped you in any way, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Remember that your financial independence is worth protecting, and you are stronger than you know. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and I wish you the wisdom to recognize true partnership and the strength to accept nothing less.